Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you again. It is about 10:39 on a Wednesday morning on another cold winter day or winter morning. So, yeah, again I want to thank everybody for checking out the channel. It's been really cool. I'm always surprised by certain videos that I put up, especially around coverage of the more obscure movies that I have uploaded on this channel that seem to always get the bigger hits. I'm always blown away by that. So to me, for me personally, and just being a fan of these films, I really find that whole thing so inspiring. That there's a lot of other weirdos out there like me that dig some of these incredibly strange, obscure films, and that there seems to be kind of an audience for this stuff, and it's great. And when I sometimes compare it to other videos that I'll put up on this channel, where the movies might be more, say, I don't know, quote unquote, bigger scale or Hollywood movies, these videos that I have on the channel that make up probably the majority, and it's still the main focus of the channel, where I cover a lot of underground and obscure movies, to see that they, at the end of the day, seem to get more and more traction, and hits and comments. I think that's always great, and it really inspires me to keep this crazy thing going, and I really appreciate it. So I really appreciate everybody checking in. And the other thing is that a lot more people have been commenting on the videos, and I love having dialogue with people and kind of networking that way through some capacity. The exchangement of ideas, and meeting a few folks who have a lot of the same interests. I just think that's super cool. It's way easier to, I feel, to have that conversation these days with people through social media, obviously, and also, with where that commonality or interest in a particular film or a particular genre that could, spur on, I don't know, maybe some kind of friendship. And I think that that's pretty cool. That really can, to a degree, bring people together and bring about that exchange of ideas, where you have, that key thing that, where you're pretty, you're kind of unified, uh, you know, unified around a certain subject. One great example of that is my great friend Emmett Layler, who I did a show with a few months ago. That was the same thing with our relationship. Was he's been a friend, and I've known him for many, many, many years. And it wasn't until we like hung out, and it was just one of those funny things that it never really came up so much. It was usually just around other things, or more of a business thing, because we play music together. So we would, we always got along. We would we would hang out and stuff here and there, but it was mostly centered on, the gig kind of scenario. And that one particular time when we came back from a gig, and the gig had gotten done early, we went out for some beers, and for whatever reason we started talking about films, and in particular horror films, and we realized, oh wow, we have this like really deep love and passion for this genre. So we were always close to begin with, but that was what made us into really good friends. So it was a pretty cool experience, and ever since then, you know, that's been a real deep kind of thing that we always share, and it's great. So before I start the show, just want to plug a couple of things, some other events. Try to always do that with this show. Going to be setting up some more interviews. I really love doing the interview segment. That's probably my favorite show. We had a show on Saturday with Spencer Roulard, Method for Madness, and that was a super fascinating show. He was an amazing guest. So if you haven't seen that video, please check that out. I think it's really great. It's one of the it's probably the longest video I have. It's about an hour and a half. There were so many things that we talked about. We basically talked about the passion and the all of the work that's involved with like designing sound and how that's related to film and kind of creating that space. Super interesting, super fascinating, with all the great ideas that Spencer brought to the table. That's my favorite thing to do within this channel. So stay tuned. There's going to be more shows coming up with that. I'm still in the process of getting a guest who I've been wanting to get for a while, but it's been really tough with scheduling and all of these things. But when I have it confirmed, there will obviously be a big announcement. It's going to be if it all works out, it's a pretty big name. So stay tuned for that. Like I said before, the biggest hurdle has been the scheduling thing. So once we get that sorted out, and I still have my fingers crossed that it will happen, I'll definitely make an announcement about that, and I will be super excited if it actually happens. So stay tuned for that. The other things that are coming up, we have a few Quantum shows coming up. This Friday, we'll be playing at the Poor Farm with my great friend Tom Luther, who has this amazing project called Sphere Music. So we're going to be doing a double show with both groups at the Poor Farm on this Friday at 5:30. Poor Farm is an amazing spot in Warren, Maine. It's a nano brewery or micro brewery place. It's in a beautiful location. They make some of the best beer. Personally, for me, I think they probably make my favorite kind of beer. We live in an area where there's all kinds of breweries right now. That whole industry has just exploded, and it has been a thing the last like 3 years or so, maybe a little bit more, but especially in the last 2 or 3 years, that's an industry that's really exploded. So there's numerous places that now are doing that kind of thing. But the cool thing around about that, probably I think the best thing around it, not only are they making all of these amazing different brews of beer, but a lot of these places are also really focusing on having entertainment and music. So I feel like in a lot of ways, it's made life a little bit easier for a lot of bands and musicians. A lot of these places are hiring bands and have been hiring bands, especially during the summertime. A few are doing it year round. So it's been really great having added venues to our community where original groups, especially around original groups, I feel like they're kind of moving a little bit more in that direction, where now they have other areas to perform and to kind of showcase their material, and they all seem to treat the bands really well and all the artists. So it's very cool, and it just opens it up to different, more and more things to go to for events and music related shows. So it's very, very cool. And it's nice because it's a different thing than, say, your typical bar gig or like even a theater gig or the private party scenario. These are like kind of alternative venues, and I think they're kind of their own little unique thing. So yeah, very cool. So that's coming up this Friday at the Poor Farm. It's a free show. Please come on by Friday the 13th. That would be great to see you guys there. And the other show we have coming up is going to be on the January 28th, which is I believe it's the last Saturday of the month. And we're going to be, Quantum will be doing a show with Spencer's group, Method for Madness. We're going to be doing that show at the Gypsy Rose Tavern, which is located in the Cedar Crest Inn, which is in Camden, Maine. And that's going to be January 28th. And that's going to be a 9 o'clock start time for that. We're kind of building that show as more, we're trying to build that show a little bit more of, maybe more of like a dance party kind of thing. We did a show together at Ada's, and that was kind of what we tried to do with that. We tried to make it where it was more of an event centered on, a little bit more of a dance kind of thing. So I'm really excited about that. Spencer's amazing. He does all of this great modular stuff, so stay tuned for that. I just started doing a little bit of promotion around that show. So in the next couple weeks, there'll be a lot more coming at you as far as that goes. And then we're also going to be doing a show at some point, probably in a couple weeks, possibly this week, but it's probably going to be in a couple weeks, where we're going to be doing a special kind of quantum set on WRFR, which is a really great local radio station based in Rockland, Maine. It's a total grassroots independent radio station. It's a great space out there. I've done a few gigs in the studio before, and this will be a show where we're going to do a little quantum set, maybe like an hour set, and it's going to be on Spencer's show. He has an electronic music show on Saturdays. So, and it's usually I think 3 o'clock in the afternoon for a couple hours. So we're going to be doing a live set on his show, and we're probably going to also do a set where we're part of it will be us, maybe just performing solo, and then we'll do another segment of the show where we're going to play together. We had that experience. We got to play together twice last year now, and the second time we played together, we kind of did that where we each kind of did a little bit of a mini set, but then we did this kind of jam. It was really, really wild. We played a few of our quantum tunes, and he kind of joined in, and then we improvised together. And I had never done that before, and that was a really inspiring and super fun experience. So I definitely want to do more of those kinds of things. I've never done anything of that nature within the quantum world, so it was very inspiring and it was really fun. So stay tuned for that when we have a date and a time and the specifics worked out. I'll definitely make some promotional things about that to get the word out. So yeah, that's going to be a super fun time. So today's show is going to be all centered on this slasher classic, Maniac Cop. This was directed by one of my favorite slasher movie directors, William Lustwig, or Bill Lustwig. I've talked a lot about various companies out there that specialize in, all things exploitation. And Bill Lustwig is such a key figure in that, not only as a director, but also the later part of his career where he essentially kind of stopped making films. I think eventually he'll probably make some more films, but because he's still pretty young and really, such a part of the scene. But he's kind of stopped making movies, and I think it was maybe 5 years ago or so, he started Blue Underground, which is a company that specializes in releasing all of these great exploitation gems. Lucio Fulci, all these are great Italian horror films. They just have an amazing catalog. And I feel like to a degree, we're, as a director and as just such a huge fan of this genre, it's almost like him paying it forward. I feel like he's talked about, I've seen lots of interviews with him, and he always talks about these films and how much they meant to him, especially in the early part of his career as a director. but then how they just inspire him and how he just generally has like a deep love for film, and particularly, and particularly it's always centered around the exploitation world. And he grew up in New York. He's a New Yorker through and through, and he was in New York when New York was a mecca for all things exploitation during the time of when 42nd Street was around and when grindhouse cinema was the thing. And New York was a very different place in the 70s and 80s. It was to a degree a much more dangerous place. But it was during that time that he grew up in New York and lived in New York and lived and breathed and soaked up everything that was looked at as like the seedy side, or the dark side of New York City. 42nd Street, that was notorious for the drug use, the prostitution. There was like all kinds of sex shops. There was, the pornography theaters were everywhere. There was prostitutes everywhere. Copious amounts of drugs and all kinds of lunacy was rampant. But they also had it was also the time when a lot of these old theaters were taken over by, were converted into movie theaters. A lot of these old theaters in New York City were at one point houses for, theater shows, operas, musicals. And after like the Great Depression, a lot of these places just kind of sat dormant. And over time, these little independent mom and pop theaters were bought by these, entrepreneurs who wanted to start showing all of these films, and that gave birth to the grindhouse cinema. So at that time, you would pay a few bucks, and you would go and you'd have that grindhouse experience where you would see, one movie after another. And there's an amazing documentary that I have where Bill Lustwig is in it, and he talked about his experience, like his formative years being a fan and being exposed to all of these great Italian classics, all of these great, giallo movies that came out, all of these European exploitation films, all of these American exploitation films, all these foreign films, and they were all, and it was, the such a magical period for horror movies. And back when horror films only relied on practical effects. And they were really sleazy, they were very grimy. And a lot of these directors that emerged during that time came out of the sex world. They had backgrounds in working in the various forms of the adult world, more or less making porn movies. So they transitioned to making, out of straight up skin flicks, to making trying to make these like theatrical movies, and then eventually they moved into horror and exploitation. But they still, a lot of these directors, because of their backgrounds, they still kind of retained a lot of the same methods of how they created movies, and still had a lot of the same aesthetics. And so everything had this real gritty, grimy nature to it. And the main thing was that so many of these films were so controversial. They dealt with a lot of forbidden fruit or taboo subjects, but they also were incredibly low budget. So they're like, incredibly gritty. So when Bill Lustwig started Blue Underground, he basically, when I said before, he kind of paid it forward. He's brought all of these movies that at one point were very popular, but then after the time of the grindhouse cinema went away, a lot of these films went into total obscurity. So he's responsible for releasing so many amazing classic films from that period and giving them this incredible treatment on Blu-ray and even 4K. Just amazing. And that, he's able to be successful. And as well, Blue Underground is probably my favorite company, and also Mondo Macabro, which is another company that specializes in movies that I think to a degree almost take a little bit of a deeper dive in more obscure, even more obscure films. But there's so many great companies. Severin is another one that's just awesome. They're amazing. Synapse is another amazing company. Code Red is another company that's put out a bunch of movies. There's a whole bunch of great companies. I naturally kind of gravitate towards Blue Underground and Mono Macabre and Severin. Those are the three companies. But I probably most of the titles I have, as far as Blu-ray movies go, are part of the Blue Underground company. And Maniac Cop, I bought this last year now. I bought this probably about 6 months ago, and this is a movie that was, part of my youth. It came out in 1988. Again, it was directed by William Lustwig. Stars the infamous and iconic Bruce Campbell, Robert Dazar, Laureen Landon, the great and wonderful Tom Atkins, and Sam Raimi, the iconic director, and Frank Pesci. This movie was definitely like a movie that I always saw as a kid. I remember always seeing the images in my head after I saw this film. It always stuck with me, the Maniac Cop. Just such a great campy slasher exploitation film. My favorite slasher film of all time is Maniac, which was directed by William Lustwig. To me, that is, and again, I love all kinds of different styles, but I naturally gravitate, like we all do. There's always a particular thing in our taste that we always kind of, we probably always go to, or a certain kind of thing or style that motivates us or inspire us, or that we just really really enjoy. And my favorite style in that realm is like the slasher films, the exploitation slasher films that were pretty dominant in the 70s and early 80s, even into the late 80s. That's my favorite style of filmmaking. And Bill Lustwig's first film was Maniac, and to me that is the grittiest, the most it's the most raw slasher film experience that you can have. I just love that movie so much. It's very disturbing, and it's so I don't know. It just feels like you're living in the trenches, or the it like captures the gutter aspect of New York. And Maniac Cop, I feel, has that same kind of vibe. It's not quite as nasty and dirty, but it still has that vibe. It was all shot in New York. This was the second movie that Bill Lustwig did. This was actually a huge franchise when it came out. When this film came out, it spawned a big franchise. I believe there's like 4 or 5 Maniac Cop films, which eventually I want to buy. And Bill Lustwig, I believe, directed all of them. But this is such a great movie. I love this movie to death. I was super excited when I bought this on Blu-ray. Again, Tom Atkins is in it. He's one of my favorite character actors. He was in so many great movies during the 70s and 80s. Probably my favorite being Halloween 3, the Season of the Witch, which is probably, aside from the first Halloween, it's probably my favorite in the franchise. I just love it because it's so incredibly different. It's just so bonkers. And Tom Atkins' character is just so not politically correct. He's kind of a scumbag. He's kind of a womanizer. Totally selfish, kind of a prick in that movie. But it's just so awesome. And his other film, which he says in interviews that he believes that is his favorite role, was Night of the Creeps, which is another amazing movie from the 80s. Super awesome horror exploitation movie. That is a movie I want to seek out and buy. There's a lot of great interviews, and there's a really great interview with Tom Atkins on this disc, where he talks about Night of the Creeps being his favorite role in his career, and he's great. And then the other film of his that I really love is John Carpenter's The Fog. He's so awesome in that. He's just got that great personality on stage and on and on the big screen. I think he's a pretty underrated actor. I feel like for the most part he's always done these real low budget kind of exploitation movies, and they're kind of silly and campy and pretty low budget. But I feel like he's got some good chops. Like he legitimately had the capability of doing drama, comedy. I think he's very funny, and being very serious, doing kind of almost melodrama based characterizations. And I think he's a really versatile actor. He was also in another John Carpenter movie, which is one of my all time favorites, Escape from New York. Amazing, and he's awesome in that too. Like he's just great. His biggest commercial role was in Lethal Weapon, starring, of course, Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. And he talks about that film in this interview for Maniac Cop, where that was like his biggest role. Like that was a huge commercial box office hit. And after he was in that film, and that film went on to become really successful, he had a pretty big career after that. And so he's always one of my favorites. I love Tom Atkins, and he hasn't acted in a while. He's gotten up there in age, but he's still great. He still looks great, and I feel like he's still got he's still got that charisma. And of course, Bruce Campbell. I mean, you can't. How can you not talk about Bruce Campbell? This is one of his first movies he ever did, and he's just so awesome. And he plays this very different role. He plays like a straight cop in the film who is accused of these murders that happen in the story. And there's an interesting thing, like when you're first kind of introduced to his character, where you kind of almost suspect him of being maybe this maniac who's responsible for these murders that are happening in New York. And he's got a lot of comedic qualities, like Bruce Campbell always does. But he's got a lot of, I just love, I mean, Bruce Campbell, just iconic, but he's got this lovable quality. Whenever you see him on screen, he's just so awesome, even if it's a small role. And he's great. I think he makes this film, he really gives this film that enjoyable, kind of fun aspect. It has, obviously compared to, say, Maniac, Bill Lustwig's first film, which is like a very serious, intense movie the whole way through. I like that this film has a little bit of a lighter tone. It's a little bit, I don't know if it's maybe a strong way to describe it, but it's a little bit easier to maybe digest for certain people. I know, like for Maniac, it's such a brutal movie and it's such a disturbing movie at times. I know it's a film that, for people that I know that are into horror films or are open to checking out a horror exploitation movie, particularly slasher film, it would probably be a little bit too intense for them. It would be a little bit too much, because it is a very intense movie. I saw a review for this film wherein it was barely talked about, and I was super disappointed. And I know we all have our tastes and we all have our interests. But again, I talk about that of where, you got to give things props. You have to give things, even if you don't like it, you have to, there's certain films and filmmakers that need to get respect, where you got to be like, okay, this might not be my cup of tea. It might be, maybe to a degree outside of my comfort zone to a point, but then it might not be my jam. But I have to acknowledge that that movie or that artist or whatever this person did is, was an iconic thing that happened, and that did influence many other films or other groups or other bands for that matter. But I recently saw an interview with a show that I like, who is a YouTube guy. I don't usually like to name drop on the show, but and I like his show, but I think he has this thing of where if it's a little bit, if it's something that challenges him in a way of where it's not maybe your standard atypical way of how a storyline will flow, and it might be kind of unorthodox or a little bit outside of the realm of tradition. He has this tendency to just dismiss it, and it goes a step further of him saying, "Well, it's not really my jam. It's not really my bag." But he'll like kind of dismiss the whole movie of, "Well, I'll never watch it again." He won't give it props and be like, "Well, actually, on the big picture of things, or in the big picture of things, or even to a degree, like from an historical context, uh, this film still had merit, and it's still regarded as a classic, and I give it that. I give the props to that." He doesn't really do that. He'll just, if it's not really something that fits in his little world, he'll just dismiss it and be like, whatever. And I feel like that's pretty lame. I always make that analogy. He did that for Maniac. And it's funny because he did a show. He always talks about loving slasher films and loving horror films, and most of the things that he does, cover that aspect. But Maniac was a movie I was really amazed at the way he just, and again, it's nothing to do with whether he liked it or not, but he just kind of dismissed it and just didn't really say, well, that movie was an iconic movie, and Bill Lustwig, definitely left a mark and has left a mark, and that movie was a huge influence, but it's not really my jam. I'm not really into that particular style, but I have to give it up for this guy. He didn't do that. He just, because it's not really his jam or his kind of style, he just wholeheartedly dismissed him as a director, and dismissed the film as being, not really even worth talking about. And I just feel that's pretty lame. And 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 especially if you're claiming, and I think he is, but really emphasizing that you're a fan of slasher films. I mean, it doesn't, I feel like slasher films, in the world of slasher films, Maniac is, kind of a holy grail. I kind of think of it as almost the analogy is like if someone is coming along and saying they like jazz, for instance, but then they're like, Miles Davis, I don't really like his music, but whatever, he was what he was, and I just kind of dismiss him. And I think the right way to do it would be, well, I am not like particularly for whatever reason, I'm not really a fan of his work. It doesn't really inspire me, but I have to acknowledge that what he did was such a central. He played such a central role in the development of that particular field. So I have to give, that commands respect. So I can't just dismiss him entirely. And this guy in particular I'm talking about does that a lot, and it does irritate me, particularly around certain exploitation directors, and especially around Italian directors. And I feel like it's really a real ignorant perception. And again, I don't think it has anything to do with whether you like something or not. There's plenty of things I don't like, and there's plenty of things I do like and that I love. But certain things always need to have a level of respect. I've talked about it before, like an analogy for me, which is more music related, is the Grateful Dead. I'm in a community where the Grateful Dead are greatly worshipped and greatly loved, and I'm not really a fan of their music. I don't really, it doesn't really, keep my interest very long. I don't really. I have lots of issues around their music. I don't really like their music at all in a lot of ways. I have respect for, say, Jerry Garcia, the guitar player and one of the founding members of the band, and I think he was a really, pretty amazing guitar player and a pretty amazing musician and a real serious creative force. And I also have a lot of respect, say, for like Mickey Hart, who was the drummer and percussionist for the Grateful Dead and had a solo career. And I've heard a lot of his stuff, and I've kind of dug some of that stuff as well as as Jerry Garcia. And so, and very respect, and I dig some of those their solo efforts. But as a whole, I don't really consider myself a fan of the Grateful Dead. And I've tried many times to kind of like be open to it. But that being said, I also, instead of not giving them props, and instead of taking that step of where I'm dismissing them entirely, of where, well, they'll just throw them out, or they're forgettable, whatever. Instead of doing that attitude, which I think is pretty ignorant and closed-minded, I have to acknowledge, well, what they did was unprecedented, and it was kind of a watershed landmark thing that they started with their band. They helped to inspire this real unique music scene that was completely outside of the traditional success story of a band. They went on to influence, and still now have influenced, millions of bands, and they left their mark. Like, they definitely uh, changed the musical landscape. So for me, I have to acknowledge that and give them props and say, well, it might not be my jam, but what they did was significant and they left their mark. So that's, and again, it has nothing to do with if I like them or don't like them. So that's a problem that I have, and an issue that I have with this one guy in particular. And I've responded with him a couple of times because I think at the end of the day, he's a highly intelligent guy and he's very smart and he knows what he's talking about and he does some really great shows. But I think when he adopts that attitude a lot, he comes across as a super ignorant person and very narrow-minded. So, but anyway, that's my rant for the day. But this transfer of Maniac Cop is spectacular. Again, this was a movie of my youth. I used to watch this all the time on VHS. I probably saw this. This was probably the first Bill Lustwig movie I saw. And I did see Maniac quite a few times when I was a kid. And that movie always terrified me, and it still does. And again, like what I said too before, like this might be a better introduction to his career for people who are a little bit less faint at heart, because it's got a little bit of a lighter tone, particularly around Bruce Campbell. It's still a great slasher movie, but it's got a little bit more of a campier kind of vibe. It's not as ultra brutal and ultra violent and forbidding or foreboding as Maniac. It's got a little bit of a lighter thing to it. It's a little bit more of a fun movie, like more of a lighter kind of tone, but it's still very much a slasher film. But I love this film. It's just so great. And again, Bill Lustwig is one of my favorites. Blue Underground is, probably my favorite company. And, Bill Lustwig is still out there. I've seen him do all kinds of interviews. Maniac Cop, which came out in 1988. Maniac Cop 2, which came out in 1990. And Maniac, which was his first film, came out in 1980. And then Maniac Cop 3, 1993. And then another film he did, which I did see a few times when I was a kid. And again, this was back on during the VHS times, back when you go to the local video store. And then there was a time where a lot of these films were shown on cable, like late at night. Another film of his that I really want to track down, which I haven't seen in a million years, Vigilante, which came out in 1983. That's a really awesome movie. Uncle Sam, which is a later film that came out in 1996. Relentless, which is one of his more recent movies. Um, and I remember seeing that movie, and that was a pretty good suspense movie. The Hit List in 1989, The Violation, um, just great. And he had a real interesting kind of relationship with Sam Raimi. Segueing back to Bruce Campbell. Sam Raimi, of course, an iconic horror director, Evil Dead, and he just recently directed the newer Doctor Strange, which I haven't seen. I've heard a lot of mixed things about it, but I do want to see it. But Sam Raimi, one of the most iconic directors, horror directors. He, Evil Dead, the Evil Dead franchise, amazing. What more can be said about that? And Sam Raimi's actually in this film. He plays this reporter, and it's super funny and hilarious. And I've seen interviews where Bill Lustwig has said that they all like knew each other, and they kind of grew up, around that same period of in New York, and they were all about the same age, and they were like all discovering these films, kind of the whole like horror exploitation film around the same time, and pretty fascinating and interesting, uh, you know, stuff that was going on. Kind of, just a total unique period in filmmaking. And Bill Lustwig always worked with this writer, Larry Cohen, who was another figure that was a key guy in the exploitation world, especially in New York during the 70s and 80s. He worked, exclusively in the exploitation world and was involved with Maniac. He's basically been involved with all of Bill Lustwig's films, helped finance them. I mean, a real key player. He wrote "It's Alive," the stuff in 1985, which is such a great movie. He directed it. Maniac Cop, Q in 1982, Maniac Cop 2. It Lives Again in 1978, and he also did Return to Salem's Lot, which I didn't realize that. But yeah, Larry Cohen, um, a real key figure in the world of exploitation. Um, he was a producer, screenwriter, and director, and he worked, mostly in the world of science fiction and horror. So the two of those guys, Bill Lustwig and Larry Cohen, I feel like they really changed the tide and changed the scope and where slasher films and horror films, particularly around the horror exploitation world, and on the American front, they really changed and shaped, you know, uh, where that genre went into where it's today, and they played such an integral part in inspiring thousands of other directors. So very cool. So if you haven't seen Maniac Cop, you need to check this out, particularly this Blu-ray edition. It's the transfer of this is spectacular. It's so crystal clear. The audio, the sound is all remastered. The picture is just immaculate. It's a really beautiful package. Some really great interviews on here. I highly recommend this film. And again, if you're new to the career of Bill Lustwig, and you have a little bit of a less of a threshold than say your average person who's into like extreme cinema, I would say that this movie would probably be the best one to check out. And then you could see Maniac. If you haven't seen Maniac before and you have a lower tolerance for excessive violence, that movie might get under your skin. But anyway, thank you again. This is Jason Dean. If you get a chance and like these videos, please like and subscribe to this channel. Really appreciate the love and support. So have a great day, and we will see you next time. Peace.